So, Mr. James, thank you so much for being with us today. Let's start first with the topic of Brexit, with the deadline looming fast at the end of March. Theresa May is obviously in a difficult situation at the moment. So what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to be a hard Brexit with no deal? Are they going to be able to amend any deal with the EU? And how will that reflect on the British economy?
Well, I'd like to think that the hard Brexit won't happen because it's so potentially disastrous, and obviously the Prime Minister's strategy seems to be to use what do they call this, brinkmanship, to kind of delay and, so that there's a sort of fait accompli. You have to choose her option or you have to go for the hard Brexit. But I would say so far, the sensible thing has never happened. As we've gone down the road in Brexit, the sensible thing has never happened. So to be honest with you, I would expect the hard Brexit to occur. It seems that people's positions are so polarized, it's very difficult to have a kind of rational compromise. And I think the European Union quite rationally don't think that whatever they can offer is going to be acceptable in Britain. So they don't seem to have much of an incentive to help. So I would think the hard Brexit is pretty likely, and most of the calculations that people have made suggest it's going to have extremely adverse economic consequences for Britain, and probably adverse political consequences also, because it's only going to breed this kind of nationalistic, populist politics which has emerged so vigorously in Britain over the last couple of years.
Do you have any projections as to how this would affect the British economy? What sectors would be most affected?
Well, I think the obvious things will happen. It'll be more difficult for Britain to export to the European Union. There'll be disinvestment. Many multinational companies who invested in Britain because it had access to this large European market will start disinvesting and moving their factories to Europe. So I think that will have impact kind of across the economy, in the city, in the finance, because more things will move to Frankfurt. And so I think it will have very broad-based impact on the British economy, not just in one or two sectors or pockets.
So how much will GDP be affected, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. People are talking about falls of 5% of GDP, but I would say, the longer consequences are very difficult to understand in terms of, for me, that's one thing, the export and tariffs and all of that and disinvestment. But for me, I'm much more concerned about the political and institutional consequences. Is this going to set off some chain of very nationalistic, isolationist, populist politics that has potential to be far worse for the economy and society than just whatever the fall in GDP will be as a consequence of hard Brexit.
And you think there's no chance of delaying the end of March deadline?
Well, there's a chance, but it doesn't seem, the Prime Minister seems to be wedded to sticking to that deadline. As far everything that I read suggests that that's what she's going to do. Yes, she feels she's committed to it.
Moving on to another big topic, which is obviously the Chinese-US war, trade war. How do you see that panning out?
Well, that's also very hard to predict. I think that the optimistic scenario, trade is good for everybody. Hundreds of millions of people in China have been dragged out of poverty by trade in the last 40 years. And the United States has benefited enormously from trade. Everyone benefits from trade. This is one thing every economist knows. So the optimistic scenario is that somehow President Trump is using this as a sort of negotiation strategy to kind of get concessions from the Chinese or whatever. But again, the world isn't necessarily organized in a way which is economically efficient, as we see from the Brexit fiasco. So it's very difficult to know what will happen. President Trump likes to grandstand and bluster, but he likes to negotiate. So I'd be more optimistic that there'd be a sensible outcome from that than the Brexit talks, because he likes making deals, President Trump,
but again,
and he likes to take the credit for making deals.
But again, there's the March 1st deadline when the tariffs will come back into play.
I think that's more fungible than the Brexit deadline. I think that's easier to renegotiate and more possible to renegotiate.
So any chance of a deal before the 1st of March, you think?
I think it's possible, yes.
Again, Venezuela is another topic that's been very hot lately, and what's going to happen with the presidency there and the impact on the economy. So what's your take on that?
Well, the impact on the economy of the Chavistas, has been pretty disastrous for a long time. But I always think, when talking about Venezuela, it's good to remember how badly run the country was before Chavez came to power. There's a reason that Chavez became president of Venezuela, and that's because it was a country with enormous poverty, rising poverty, inequality, corruption. It was a typical Latin American elite-controlled oligarchic society, and I think President Chavez's election was a kind of popular backlash against how badly run the country had been. Everyone seems to forget that nowadays. They sort of think all the problems were caused by Chavez, but that's not true at all. That being said, what's going on now is absolutely horrible. I mean, my understanding is the country's being run by the military more than anything else. There are some hardcore supporters still, because I think especially President Chavez, who was much more politically skilled than President Maduro, he did redistribute income and build housing and healthcare for poor people and many of his supporters. But it's not a model which has really helped average Venezuelans. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the opposition, so Senor Guaido, I mean, we don't really know very much about him or what he plans to do. So I think it's right that President Maduro, is pretty illegitimate in the eyes of many Venezuelans. But whether or not this confrontation will lead to something better in Venezuela is hard to predict, given how little we know about the opposition. We don't really know much about their plans. We know that they're anti-Chavista, but, President Chavez was anti the old system, and he just replaced it with something similar.
But the opposition has also gained the support of many different governments, including the US government, Canadian government, and other governments.
Yes, I find that quite curious, actually, because there's many illegitimate governments which are far more authoritarian than the Venezuelan government. President Trump seems quite happy to talk to North Korea, for example, but the North Korean government makes Venezuela look like Switzerland. I mean, President Maduro doesn't go around killing thousands of people or imprisoning hundreds of thousands of opponents, or even the Chinese government for that matter. As we talk, there's 1 million Uyghurs in Western China in prisoner camps, basically, undergoing re-education. The Chinese government kills far more people than the Venezuelan government does. So why don't we not recognize the Chinese government? I don't quite understand the logic of this. If you're going to have principles about what sort of regimes you're going to recognize and not, you should apply them consistently. And I'm not saying anything good about the Maduro government. I just feel it's a bit inconsistent the way he's being treated at the moment.
Okay, but it does seem from the way you're talking that you're pro-Maduro.
I'm not pro-Maduro, but I think, you should be consistent in the way you deal with non-democratic regimes. And I'm just saying, on the scale of things, the Venezuelan government is not one of the world's most autocratic regimes by any stretch of the imagination. So why pick on him?
So if we want to just talk about the impact on the economy of what's been happening and the likelihood of Guaido coming into power.
Yeah. No, the impact's been disastrous. The Venezuelans are significantly poorer than they were in the past, and but I think if you look around the world, there's many countries like that. Think about Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans have about half the income per capita that they did in 1980 when they became independent, almost 40 years ago. And there seems every prospect of that continuing, unfortunately. So Argentina, you mentioned Argentina earlier. That's a country which has been suffering from this very perverse type of economic policy since the 1940s. It just seems very difficult to exit once you get into a particular political place like that.
Thank you so much.